It began with a single photograph, a faded image found in a rusted film canister buried beneath the floorboards of a farmhouse in northern France. The picture showed a group of soldiers, mud to their knees, standing before a strange dome-shaped structure. No markings, no insignia, just weary faces staring into the lens of history. When the canister was opened in 2019, archivists realized it belonged to a missing unit from 1944, men officially listed as relocated by Allied command. But their trail ended there. Until now, what really happened inside the valley they called the Silent Field? Chapter 1. Shadows Before the Storm. In the years before the world fell apart, Europe stood at a fragile crossroads. The 1930s carried a strange silence, a deceptive calm that stretched across cities rebuilding from the ashes of the Great War. Paris hummed with jazz and optimism. London wrestled with unemployment and pride. Berlin, still haunted by humiliation, buzzed with a new energy. The sound of speeches echoing in crowded halls, the rustle of flags rising again. Ordinary people went to work, bought bread, fixed bicycles, and read newspapers filled with hope and fear in equal measure. Across fields and factories, men and women sensed change but could not name it. The world had seen peace for 20 years, but it was an uneasy peace. Borders were redrawn, debts unpaid, and promises made by tired leaders who believed that another war was simply impossible. They were wrong. In Germany, the voice of Adolf Hitler grew louder each month. His words, once shouted in beer halls, now thundered through radios and stadiums. He spoke of destiny, of betrayal, of a wounded nation rising again. The people listened, desperate for pride, jobs, and order. The old republic faded as banners unfurled across rooftops, and the march of boots became the rhythm of daily life. In Britain and France, diplomats debated, calculating how far they could bend without breaking. The League of Nations, once the world's hope for peace, had become a hollow echo, a council of speeches without consequence. In Spain, civil war was tearing the land apart, serving as a brutal rehearsal for what was coming. Soviet pilots, German tanks, and Italian troops all tested their weapons beneath Spanish skies, while the rest of the world watched from a safe distance, or so they thought. Meanwhile, in the countryside of France, farmers began to see foreign uniforms near their borders again. Old trenches from 1918 still scarred the earth, reminders of a generation's sacrifice. In Germany, rearmament factories glowed through the night. Steel replaced silence. By 1938, Austria had fallen without a shot. The Anschluss, the Union, was broadcast like a homecoming parade. In Munich, Western leaders shook hands with Hitler, believing they had preserved peace by giving him what he wanted. "Peace for our time," Neville Chamberlain declared. Crowds cheered in London. Yet in the cafes of Prague and Warsaw, no one felt safe. Ordinary soldiers, trained under false pretenses, told their exercises were precautionary. Women in factories began producing uniforms and munitions labeled as exports. Governments issued ration guidelines just in case. Fear was becoming routine. And beneath it all, beneath the politics and parades, intelligence officers whispered of something else. Secret research stations buried deep beneath the Ardennes, transport convoys moving only at night, orders signed but never archived. Code names like Echo Glass, Nordwind, and Morning Star began to appear in intercepted communications. But in 1938, no one dared to believe that history was already being rewritten in secret. Across the Atlantic, the United States watched carefully. The Great Depression had crippled the economy, and isolationism still ruled the public mood. Yet some within Washington's quiet offices were already making preparations, studying maps, establishing contact with European scientists, and tracking the rise of a new military doctrine that fused technology and ideology. By 1939, the fuse had been lit. The invasion of Poland shattered every illusion of peace. Radio stations crackled with reports of columns of armor rolling east, bombers slicing through dawn skies, and entire towns consumed by fire. Europe had fallen back into its nightmare. But within the chaos, deeper operations had already begun, missions so secret that even generals didn't know their true objectives. Hidden in sealed files were names of scientists, engineers, and codebreakers assigned to experimental units, buried within the machinery of total war. Their work would never appear on battle maps, yet their discoveries would shape the course of history. As the world plunged into conflict once again, the men of the 11th Field Reconnaissance Unit, later listed as missing, were quietly dispatched to northern France. Their orders were vague, their clearance higher than any frontline division. What they were sent to investigate was not a battle, nor an enemy stronghold, but a structure, something unearthed by accident in a remote valley near the Somme. The file describing it was marked with a single word: confidential. And so the stage was set. The storm had broken. Armies were moving. Nations were burning. Yet beneath the smoke, another story was waiting. One buried in the soil of northern France, where silence still lingers over an unmarked field. Chapter 2: The Machinery of Belief. The storm that broke in September 1939 was not just a war of armies. It was a war of conviction. Across Europe, leaders spoke not merely of victory, but of destiny, survival, and fear. Words became weapons, and truth itself was reshaped to fit the needs of the state. For Germany, the war was a crusade to reclaim what had been lost: land, dignity, and control. Propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels filled every cinema, radio, and newspaper with a single narrative. Germany was encircled, betrayed, and now justified in striking back. It was a message that found eager listeners among a population raised in scarcity and resentment. Even as bombs began to fall, many citizens still believed they were fighting for renewal, not conquest. In Britain, Prime Minister Chamberlain's resignation gave way to Winston Churchill, a man of fierce words and unyielding will. "We shall fight on the beaches, we shall never surrender." Those sentences echoed across a nation under siege, giving courage to people sheltering beneath the ruins of their own streets. In the fields and towns of England, ordinary families listened by candlelight as Churchill's gravel voice broke through the static, each pause carrying the weight of resolve. Meanwhile, in occupied Europe, the machinery of control grew cold and efficient. German intelligence agencies, the Abwehr and the Sicherheitsdienst, worked hand in hand to suppress resistance, monitor scientists, and secure any research that might benefit the Reich. They scoured universities, laboratories, and archives. Anything of use, from chemical studies to experimental engines, was confiscated or copied. In this shadow network, Operation Echo Glass was conceived. It began as a small division under the Luftwaffe's technical branch, tasked with gathering information on Allied radar systems. But as the war expanded, so did its ambition. The goal was not just detection, it was invisibility. To see without being seen. Captured Allied documents mention the codename only twice, each time partially redacted. One line reads, "Field unit to retrieve unknown structure at coordinates north of Amiens. Possible anomalous design, metallic non-standard composition." Another line, dated October 1940, lists the personnel, 12 names, all later declared missing in action. Historians believe these were reconnaissance engineers, fluent in both science and survival, men chosen for a mission outside official command channels. Among them was Lieutenant Henri Duval, a French defector turned Allied informant. His diary, discovered decades later in a Swiss attic, paints a haunting picture of those final weeks. "They told us it was just an inspection," he wrote, "but the officers spoke in whispers, and the coordinates led us nowhere near any front line. The valley was quiet, too quiet." Back in Berlin, the political atmosphere had grown feverish. Hitler's early victories in France and the Low Countries gave him near-divine authority among his generals. Those who questioned strategy were dismissed or reassigned. The scientific elite, men like Werner von Braun and Hans Kammler, were given near-limitless resources, encouraged to chase impossible ideas. Rocket propulsion, jet aircraft, and radar countermeasures were no longer experiments. They were state priorities. But even within this hierarchy of innovation, some projects were deemed too secret, too dangerous, or simply too strange. Files labeled Special Weapons Development were stored in restricted archives beneath the Reich Chancellery. Access required written authorization from Kammler himself. One such project, referenced only as Der Klang, the sound, was said to involve resonance-based technologies capable of disrupting communication signals. Later researchers speculated that Echo Glass may have been an Allied response to this effort, a mirror operation seeking to understand what Germany was building. By 1941, the world had split entirely. The Axis advance reached its peak, and for a brief moment it seemed that Europe itself might vanish beneath the weight of the Reich. But amid the marching columns and coded transmissions, men like Duval and his team continued their work in silence, assigned to missions they barely understood. What drove them forward wasn't ideology, it was duty, curiosity, and the desperate hope that knowledge might save lives. They had seen what unchecked power could do. They wanted to prevent it from spreading further. Letters recovered from British archives reveal the psychological toll. One engineer wrote to his wife, "We are deep in something we cannot explain. The machines we're told to inspect. They look like they were built by no one we know. There are layers of metal, but not riveted, not forged. It's as if they grew that way. They told us not to ask." Meanwhile, Allied intelligence wrestled with its own secrets. In London, Bletchley Park codebreakers intercepted signals that made no sense. Transmissions without call signs sent on frequencies outside normal military bands. Some believed they were decoys, others suspected they were experiments. The truth, as it often does in war, disappeared in the noise. As the tide of conflict turned toward the east, Operation Echo Glass vanished from official dispatches. Its field reports stopped abruptly in early 1944 during the final Allied push into France. Headquarters marked the unit as relocated pending reorganization. No further communication was ever recorded. Yet even in silence, traces remained. A requisition log for experimental photographic film, a shipment manifest listing lead-lined canisters. A handwritten note in the margin of a field journal. Structure sealed. Recommend site containment. What those men found in that valley, and why it was buried for nearly 80 years, would not be known until a storm in 2019 washed away the soil that had hidden their last discovery. But for now, in 1944, their story was swallowed by the war itself, and history moved on, unaware that a secret had been locked beneath the fields of France, waiting for someone, someday, to remember. Chapter 3: The Silent Field. Dawn broke grey and heavy over northern France. The war had shifted again, Allied forces pushing inland, German lines fracturing but still dangerous. The air smelled of oil and rain, thick with the metallic sting of spent shells. Amid the confusion of advancing columns and makeshift command posts, the 11th Field Reconnaissance Unit moved quietly, their convoy slipping through narrow farm roads veiled in mist. It was June 1944, a month after D-Day. The countryside was scarred but alive with movement. Convoys, supply trucks, medical tents, and columns of exhausted soldiers filled every lane. Yet the men of the 11th were travelling alone, their orders handwritten and sealed, bearing no divisional stamp. They were told to locate a structure of strategic interest north of Amiens, nothing more. Lieutenant Henri Duval rode in the lead jeep, eyes fixed on the horizon. His men, 11 engineers, a radio operator, and 2 drivers, had been selected for their technical backgrounds, not their marksmanship. Most carried notebooks instead of rifles. The youngest, Corporal Webb, carried a camera, its lens wrapped in cloth to keep out the dust. The road descended into a shallow valley ringed by birch trees. Smoke drifted from the distance, the aftermath of another skirmish. Another nameless village burned. When the convoy halted, the engines clicked and sighed in the cool air. Duval stepped out, scanning the terrain. Ahead lay what looked like an ordinary field, except for the ground itself. It wasn't earth. It was fused, glassy, dark as coal, spreading out like a frozen lake. The men approached cautiously. Their boots echoed with a faint, hollow tone. The surface shimmered faintly under the clouds. Duval knelt, brushed his glove across it. Smooth, cold, artificial. A sergeant unpacked a small field radio and set it to transmit coordinates. The signal came back distorted, sharp bursts of static that didn't match any known interference. The radio operator frowned, adjusting the dials. "It's bouncing back," he muttered, "like it's talking to itself." They advanced toward the center of the valley. There, half buried in the fused soil, was a metallic dome, about 5 meters wide, half collapsed on one side. It was scorched, but intact enough to show its strange geometry. No seams, no rivets. The surface seemed grown, not built. A faint hum, almost inaudible, lingered beneath the wind. Duval ordered the team to set up perimeter lights and begin documentation. Webb began taking photographs, each flash cutting through the fog like a heartbeat. Inside the dome, the air was stale, metallic, almost sterile. Fragments of cloth and broken instruments littered the ground. A small emblem was burned into one panel, a stylized eagle, but not German, not Allied. It was unfamiliar. Private Heller found the first crate near the entrance. Inside, sealed in wax paper, were documents, technical schematics, equations, and a log written in both German and English. The date, February 1944. The signature, Leiterm Siemda R. Albrecht, Echo Glass Field Division. The men exchanged looks. The name was unfamiliar, the contents stranger still. One diagram appeared to show an acoustic chamber, a kind of amplifier designed not for sound, but for electromagnetic waves, a weapon perhaps, or an experiment. The papers were quickly packed and tagged for transport. As the sun rose higher, Duval noticed something unsettling. Birds avoided the valley entirely. Not a single crow or sparrow crossed the perimeter. When they did, they veered away sharply, as if pushed by invisible wind. At 1100 hours, Duval gave the order to open the hatch at the base of the dome. It resisted at first, fused shut by heat. After several attempts, the engineers pried it open. A rush of stale air escaped, followed by silence. The tunnel descended steeply, metal steps leading into darkness. They descended one by one. The tunnel walls were coated in soot but unscarred by explosion. The deeper they went, the colder it became. A single bulb flickered weakly on the ceiling, powered by a battery that should not have lasted days, let alone months. At the base was a chamber, circular, lined with strange equipment. In the center stood a platform, surrounded by broken glass cylinders. A faint electrical odor hung in the air. Heller approached a console covered in dials labeled in both German and Cyrillic. "Looks like power regulation," he said softly. "But it's still active." Before Duval could respond, the lights pulsed once. The air seemed to vibrate, a low, resonant hum that crawled through the floor. The men froze. The hum deepened, steady, rhythmic, almost like breathing. Webb raised his camera, snapped a photo. The flash illuminated the room, and for a fraction of a second, they saw it. A figure. Not a man, not fully. A silhouette burned into the far wall, as if someone had stood there when a blast of unimaginable heat struck. The edges were sharp, the proportions wrong. Duval felt the air tighten in his chest. "Shut it down," he ordered. Heller pulled the main breaker. The hum stopped. Silence returned. They gathered what they could. Papers, photographs, samples of the fused soil. Everything was loaded into the convoy by nightfall. Before leaving, Duval ordered the entrance sealed with thermite. The valley was marked off on their maps with a single word: secured. As they drove away, Webb looked back once more. The fog had settled again, hiding the valley beneath a pale blanket. Yet he swore he could still hear the faint hum beneath the engine's noise, like the earth itself remembering. 2 weeks later, the entire 11th Field Reconnaissance Unit disappeared from official record. No casualty reports, no graves, no transmissions, only a requisition form for classified material transport, signed in London and never processed. The photographs surfaced decades later, film undeveloped, sealed in a canister beneath the floorboards of Duval's farmhouse. What they captured would reignite one of the greatest unsolved mysteries of the war, and reveal how far governments were willing to go to bury what they could not explain. Chapter 4. After the silence. When the war finally ended, Europe exhaled. Not in relief, but exhaustion. Cities lay in ruins, rail lines twisted like broken bones. The air itself smelled of ash and gasoline. Millions wandered roads with nowhere to go, carrying what was left of their lives in bundles and suitcases. For many, the promise of peace felt hollow. The sound of gunfire had faded, but the silence that followed was heavier still. The 11th Field Reconnaissance Unit was never mentioned in debriefings. In the vast bureaucracy of post-war reconstruction, entire divisions disappeared beneath paperwork, excuses, and missing archives. Families wrote letters, desperate for news. None came. Official statements listed the men as presumed lost in northern operations. No coordinates, no remains, no answers. Henri Duval's name surfaced only once, in a handwritten memo between British intelligence officers dated 1946. It referenced missing documentation related to Project Echo Glass, likely sealed per prior directive. After that, even the name was erased. But war has a way of leaving traces, whispers that refuse to die. In the decades that followed, rumors circulated among military historians. Stories of a forbidden valley near Amiens, where locals claimed nothing would grow. Farmers spoke of their plows striking metal beneath the soil. French authorities fenced the area in the 1950s, declaring it unsafe due to unexploded ordnance. No one questioned it. Some secrets are easier to forget when labeled dangerous. Across the Channel, the newly formed intelligence agencies of the Cold War era inherited mountains of classified material from their wartime predecessors. Many documents were destroyed, some deliberately, others simply lost in the shuffle of reorganized offices and changing code names. Yet buried within the files of the Ministry of Defense was a short, unsigned note. Recovered materials indicate non-standard metallurgy and radiation irregularities. Site to remain sealed. Refer all inquiries to Division Liaison under Nordwind Directive. And so, the story of the silent field slipped into myth. By the 1960s, as superpowers raced to space and armed satellites orbited above, only a handful of veterans remembered the mission's name. Most were old, ill, or bound by oaths they no longer fully understood. One, a communications officer named Raymond Webb, resurfaced briefly in 1967, giving an interview to a small French radio station about strange sounds beneath the earth. The recording never aired. Webb died 2 months later in what police called a household accident. His notebooks vanished from evidence. Meanwhile, governments on both sides of the Iron Curtain began encountering unexplained interference across communication bands, bursts of static repeating at irregular intervals. Engineers described them as echoes, signals that mirrored transmissions seconds after they were sent. Some believed they were reflections from the upper atmosphere. Others, quietly, suspected a more earthly origin. By 1989, as the Berlin Wall fell and archives across Europe opened, researchers hoped to piece together what had been hidden. But the Echo Glass files were nowhere to be found. Requests to both NATO and the French Ministry of Defense returned the same phrase. No records exist under that designation. Then, in 2019, the storm came. Heavy rainfall across the Somme region caused landslides that exposed long-buried concrete and steel. Local archaeologists called in for assessment discovered fragments of metal fused with glass. The same black, glossy material described in Duval's final report. When radiation teams arrived, they found no danger, but their instruments malfunctioned, each producing the same rhythmic pulse, like a heartbeat. Among the debris lay the canister, rusted, dented, but still sealed. Inside were 12 rolls of undeveloped film, a handful of photographs, and a fragment of a report bearing the Echo Glass insignia. The images were faded but clear enough to reveal what the world had forgotten. The dome, the valley, the men standing before it. The discovery was quietly transferred to the archives of the Musée de l'Armée in Paris. Publicly, officials referred to it as a lost reconnaissance unit's documentation. But among historians and intelligence veterans, the find reignited old arguments. Some insisted it was evidence of early radar research. Others whispered of an abandoned German energy experiment. A few claimed it was something else entirely, a relic of a technology never completed, perhaps never understood. In quiet corners of museums and universities, analysts studied the photos, noting patterns in the metal's surface, the faint distortion in the air around the structure, the blurred edges as if the image itself resisted being captured. Nothing conclusive was found, but every expert who examined the material reported the same strange sensation, an almost imperceptible vibration, a low hum in the archive room that faded the moment they stepped outside. Today, The valley remains closed, fenced, and patrolled under the guise of environmental protection. The official explanation is contamination, though no hazardous materials have ever been recorded. Locals avoid it. At night, they say, the wind carries a sound, not quite machinery, not quite voice, that rolls across the fields like distant thunder. For those who still chase the truth, the evidence is fragmentary. A name, a photograph, a hum. But history has always been written from what survives, and sometimes from what refuses to stay buried. In the end, the men of the 11th Reconnaissance Unit vanished without recognition, their story locked beneath bureaucratic silence. Yet in every photograph, in every brittle page of their recovered logbooks, their presence lingers not as ghosts, but as witnesses to the strange intersection of science, secrecy, and war. What they uncovered in that silent field may never be fully known. But perhaps that's the point. Some discoveries were never meant to be explained, only remembered. Chapter 5. The Weight of Forgotten Truths. The decades since the war have softened many of its edges. The uniforms are now museum pieces. The speeches, archival recordings. The men and women who lived through it, mostly gone. Yet some stories refuse to fade. They wait in the quiet, resurfacing when the world is ready to listen. The silent field is one of them. When historians speak of World War II, they often describe grand strategies and sweeping movements. But beneath those headlines lies something more elusive, the countless secrets buried in pursuit of victory. Every nation hid things, experiments, technologies, decisions that blurred the line between necessity and morality. The rediscovery of the echo glass materials was not just another footnote in military history. It was a reminder of how much was hidden, how much was denied, and how much remains unspoken. The surviving documents offer no confession, no clear motive, only fragments, coordinates, signatures, and the occasional trembling line of handwriting. It's still alive, one note reads. No context, no explanation. Perhaps a metaphor, or perhaps not. What mattered more was the silence that followed, the deliberate absence of answers. Governments that once fought for the world's future could not, or would not, account for what their own archives concealed. In the years after 2019, researchers began comparing recovered echo glass schematics with declassified Cold War experiments. Patterns emerged, studies into acoustic resonance, electromagnetic reflection, and wave harmonics, nearly identical to those hinted at in Duval's recovered files. Projects run under names like Blue Mercury in Britain, Signal 7 in the US, and Vector Z in the Soviet Union. Different nations, different flags, yet the same pursuit, to control sound, signal, and perception itself. Some believe these operations were continuations of wartime research, fragments of ideas scavenged from the ruins of Europe and repurposed by new powers. Others argue they were independent coincidences, born of the era's technological hunger. Whatever the truth, the echoes of that lost valley carried further than anyone imagined. And what of the men, the engineers, the scientists, the soldiers whose work was redacted, their names erased? For every innovation that changed history, there were countless others that vanished into secrecy. Their discoveries, successes, and failures became invisible footnotes to progress. The public saw rockets, radar, and jet engines, but never the prototypes that failed, or the teams that disappeared testing them. When Duval's photographs surfaced, historians saw more than an artifact. They saw evidence of human curiosity colliding with the moral weight of discovery. That small dome in the French Valley was not just a machine, it was a symbol of what war does to knowledge. It twists it, hides it, buries it, and when peace returns, we tell ourselves the worst of it is behind us. But some truths remain too heavy to lift. There's a line from one of Duval's recovered letters, addressed to no one, dated July 1944. If we survive this, history will never believe what we've seen, and if we don't, it won't matter. Those words linger like an echo, simple, resigned, but painfully human. They remind us that behind every classified file is a person, standing at the intersection of duty and conscience. They remind us that the pursuit of knowledge, once tied to war, never truly escapes its consequences. Today, the silent field is overgrown, grass covers the scars, and wildflowers bloom where the soil once burned. Farmers work nearby, unaware that beneath the earth lie remnants of something mankind could not explain, or perhaps chose not to. The photographs remain locked in controlled archives, their details accessible only to a handful of curators. Officially, there's nothing there worth remembering, but history has its own memory. It surfaces through chance, a misplaced photo, a forgotten tape, a storm that shifts the ground just enough. And when it does, we're forced to confront the simple truth that the past does not disappear. It waits. The rediscovery of Echo Glass wasn't just about the war. It was about the limits of our own understanding, how easily nations trade truth for security, and how often progress is built on silence. As the final reports concluded their analysis, one archivist left a quiet note in the file's margin. Whatever it was not built to destroy. It was built to listen. And maybe that's what remains to be learned. Not the nature of the machine or the secret it held, but the act of listening itself to the echoes of a forgotten generation, to the lessons buried beneath ambition, to the voices that still hum through time, faint but unbroken, because every field of silence has a story. And every story, no matter how deeply hidden, waits for someone, someday, to hear it.